Hi guys, today we're going to be replacing the screen on an iPhone 8. You're going to need the following tools: a pencil lobe screwdriver, a tri-wing screwdriver, a cross-wing / Phillips screwdriver, spudger / pick, replacement iPhone 8 screen. The tools which are currently on screen are non-essential. If you're a DIYer, you might not have access to these tools, but they certainly make the job easier. You'll need a hairdryer or a heat gun, a screen pry tool, tweezers, and adhesive seal. The adhesive seal for if you want your iPhone to remain watertight after it's done, or at least water resistant anyway. You may notice in the video that I did not replace the water seal. The reason for this was because I didn't actually repair the back of the phone, and the customer was going to have it repaired shortly once he got the cash ready. So I didn't see the point in replacing it for such a short amount of time. Okay, let's jump into the repair. So as you can see from the video, the iPhone's in really poor condition. The front is smashed, it's not responsive to touch, it's completely dead. The chassis is actually bent up at the top. I think he threw it at a radiator. The back of the phone is smashed. I did advise that we could replace this, but he wasn't happy with the additional cost, so he's going to have that repaired on a later date. I've stuck some tape to the back of the phone just to stop me from cutting my fingers, and also when it gets handed back to the customer, he's going to put it straight into a case as it was crumbling to pieces. So the first thing that we need to do is take the two screws out of the base of the phone. These are pencil lobe screws, so you'll need a pencil lobe screwdriver. As you can see, they're pretty easy to come out, it's literally two screws. Once these two screws have been removed, we need to basically remove the screen from the phone. As you can see, I used the heat gun just to aid heating the adhesive up a little bit and make it a little bit easier pulling it off. You do not need to do this, it just makes it a little bit more tricky when you're taking the screen off. I also used the screen pry tool, as you can see, just to get the first edge and then went in with the spudger. But if I'd have spent a little bit more time, I should have easily been able to get in with the spudger on its own. You should too if you don't have a screen pry tool. Once that's done, open it up. Make sure you don't pry down the right hand side of the screen, as you can damage the flex cables. So once this is opened up, the first thing that we need to do is disconnect the battery. We can do that by removing the bracket. So there's 4 screws to hold this on. You need a cross-wing screwdriver, as you can see on the image. Once these 4 screws have been removed, the bracket should just lift away. Once the bracket's out of the way, you should be able to get in and disconnect the battery. Make sure you do this first before disconnecting the digitizer or the LCD screen. I've learned the hard way about disconnecting the LCD and the digitizer before first, as it can pretty much blow one of the capacitors on the board. And then you need a micro solder, and that costs a fortune. So next you want to disconnect the digitizer and the LCD cable, and then it's the bracket up at the top. That's held on by 3 screws, cross-wing or a Phillips screwdriver. Take these out. I had a bit of trouble with these because they weren't magnetic, so I struggled like mad to get them out, but just take your time, you should be able to get all 3 out. Once those 3 screws have been removed, the bracket should just lift away, and then you've just got to disconnect the last Phillips, which is holding the screen assembly to the phone. Once this has been disconnected, the screen should pull away from the phone. We can put this aside for now. As you can see, the phone is really bent in the top corner, so just a little bit of brute force. If it was on the other corner where the logic board was, I'd be a little bit more wary and I'd actually remove the logic board, but there's not too many components in this top left hand corner, so just get a good grab of the phone and just push the corner really hard. By the end of this, you'll see that the phone still wasn't perfect, but it was a lot better than what it was previously. So next we need to remove the bracket which keeps the front facing camera in place. This is held in place by 3 screws, cross-wing screwdriver or Phillips, whatever you want to call it. Once these 3 screws have been removed, the bracket will lift away from the screen assembly. Next up, we'll be removing the ear speaker. These secure with 2 Phillips or cross-wing screws. If you hold back the camera flex, this should give you easy access to remove the 2 screws. Once these 2 screws have been removed, it's time to remove the flex, which contains the proximity sensor. front facing camera and the ambient light sensor. As you can see on the video, I use the heat gun. The heat gun isn't 100% compulsory, but it's highly recommended as it can be very difficult to remove the flex from the phone as the adhesive can be quite tough. If you don't have access to a heat gun, you can use a hairdryer. That pretty much does the same job, just to get it a little bit warm. If you've heated up the display assembly, you'll find the next bit a lot easier. Take your pick and place it underneath the top edge of the flex to remove the proximity sensor and the ambient light sensor. Once they're back, I would suggest that you start underneath the contacts where the ear speaker meets the flex. You'll see 4 gold little circles. As you can see in the video, I use the tweezers underneath this to break the adhesive between the screen assembly and the flex. Just be very, very gentle as it is very easily damaged. Next, we need to remove the 6 tri-wing screws which secure the back plate to the LCD. Now, before we can remove the back plate completely, we need to remove the home button from the screen assembly. Now, be very careful with the home button, as if this is damaged in any way, shape or form, you will lose access to Touch ID and very possibly the home button altogether. So start by removing the 4 tri-wing screws located at the bottom of the screen assembly. The back plate will now lift away from the phone. Next job is to unclip the home button from the screen assembly. You will see down in the bottom corner that it's folded over. The easiest way to do this is to get the pick in between the two and gently pry the connector away from the other connector. Next, in order to remove the home button flex from the screen assembly, we need to break the adhesive between the flex and the screen assembly. Again, it's advised that use a heat gun or a hairdryer to heat up the adhesive in order to make it easier to remove the flex from the screen assembly. In this video you'll see I used a small knife just to get an edge on the flex. I wouldn't advise copying this method. I'd try a bit harder with the pick, as it is possible with the pick. It was just getting the first edge was quite difficult. Once I got the first edge, I removed the rest of the adhesive with the pick. As you can see, I took my time with this. And the home button fell out of the front screen assembly. If yours doesn't fall out, it should easily pop out. Next, it's time to remove the back plate. If you are sure that the flexes are not trapped in the back plate, you'll then be able to lean it forward and lightly pull off the adhesive. Obviously this is a rubbish screen anyway, which is going to be binned, so I wasn't too bothered about damaging this screen, but we do need the back plate for the new assembly. So here's the new screen which was supplied by the customer. He said it cost around £20 or £30. You can tell it's a cheap Chinese one, but it'll do the job. So what we need to do is transfer the little bracket which holds the front facing camera in place. We do also need the little bracket which holds the front flex in place, but we can transfer this over later. You'll see I removed the front facing camera bracket with a pair of tweezers. It shouldn't be too difficult to pull out. Once it's pulled out, it should just pop into place in the new screen. There's no adhesive that holds it down, but once the bracket's back in place, it'll hold it all together. Next, we're going to install the back plate to the back of the new LCD. Just thread the cables through for the new digitizer and LCD. Make sure that the holes line up on the side. And once you've got them nice and aligned, we need to reinsert the 6 tri-wing screws that we removed earlier. Next, we need to install the home button back into the phone. As you can see, I had to work around the screen protector just to get the home button initially back in there. You'll see there's a little plastic tab which the flex will sit on to get it back into place correctly. Once it's sat back in place, clip the connector back on for the screen assembly. Put the bracket back in place and install the 4 tri-wing screws that were removed earlier. Next, we need to transfer the little bracket which holds the front sensors in place from the old LCD to the new screen assembly. I forgot to do this initially and I was told that the new LCD assembly came with these brackets, but it turned out that they didn't. These shouldn't be too difficult to remove. I used a pair of tweezers, and if they're broken in the process, they're really not that expensive to buy from eBay. It is possible that your replacement screen will have already come with these brackets, so you may not need to transfer them over. Next, remove the tab which protects the adhesive, ready to stick down the flex. The easiest way to reinstall the flex is to line up the 4 gold rings, which is the connector for the ear speaker, as there's 2 little tabs which will hold this in place, and then the rest will line up. It can be a little bit tricky, but you must make sure that the sensors go back into the correct brackets, otherwise you'll have problems where the proximity sensor doesn't work. Once you're happy with the location of the flex, it's time to reinstall the ear speaker. You can do this by placing this over the top of the flex and reinstalling the 2 crosswing or Phillips screws that we removed earlier. Now gently fold the front facing camera over the top of the ear speaker and reinstall the bracket which we removed earlier. This is held in place by 3 crosswing or Phillips screws. The LCD assembly is now ready to go back into the phone. At this point, if you were wanting to reinstall the water resistance adhesive, I would suggest cleaning around the chassis like I did here. As mentioned previously, the customer didn't want this doing to their phone, as they were going to have the back replaced very shortly, so I just get it a quick clean up, ready for the new screen to go back in. Place the right hand side of the screen assembly down the right hand side of the phone and reconnect the top flex. This can be very tricky, as even though I cut the video, it took me a lot longer than it looks on this video because it's twisted round, but you'll eventually get the hang of it. And then you need to reinstall the little bracket at the top. Now the screws for this bracket were not magnetic. I struggled like mad to get them back in all honesty, but I did get them back in the end, and if you take your time you should be able to get them back in. The screwdriver, you'll need to replace the 3 screws with a crosswing or Phillips screwdriver, just as it was to remove them. Now it's time to pop on the flex connectors for the digitizer and LCD. Don't push down on them too hard, but you should feel them lightly click back into place. Pop back down the battery connector and it's time to reinstall the bracket. This is held on by 4 crosswing or Phillips screws. These are magnetic, so it shouldn't take much time. Just make sure that the screws which were taken out go back into the same holes that they were removed from. Now that the screws and brackets are all back in place, it's time for us to pop down the LCD and test it. It's always advisable to just make sure it turns on, you at least get the Apple logo before popping the screen down, as it can be quite difficult to get it all back up again, and you always risk the chance of damaging the phone and the new LCD. I tested the LCD functionality, I tested the ear speaker, the proximity sensor, the buttons on the side, the silence, sleep wake, power button, everything like that, and it's all functioning fine. So it's time to pop down the LCD back into the phone. The top edge of the LCD hooks underneath the top of the phone chassis. Once that's hooked underneath, work your way around slowly, clicking the sides of the screen assembly back into the phone itself. If you have any trouble with this, you can be a little bit forceful, but don't be too forceful, as you'll hear it click back into place. Once it's all clicked back into place, we need to replace the 2 pencil lobe screws that we removed earlier. Once the 2 screws are back in the phone, that's it, the repair is complete. I had a couple of questions on my last video. No, the True Tone did not work on this phone after the repair. The home button, everything else worked perfectly fine. You will lose access to the True Tone, but comparing it to the price what Apple charged for a screen replacement, I found that the customer was willing to lose this feature on the basis that the phone were back up and working. Thanks for watching this video, and please subscribe to my channel.